Okay, thank you, Drew. Today I'm going to tell you a less success story about a site in Bridgewater, Connecticut. Next slide, please. So where is Bridgewater? Bridgewater is a small town in Richfield County, located in the eastern part of the state, north of Danbury. If you look closely, and this is a poor picture, but you can faintly see the line marking the border of Connecticut and New York. So that'll kind of give you an idea where Danbury is. Next slide, please. Bridgewater is. Next slide, please. The Bridgewater convenience store is located in an area with a GAA groundwater classification. The site and all neighboring properties are serviced with potable water by private wells. Going into March 2018, this site did not have any previously recorded UST releases. It had two 8,000-gallon gasoline USTs, which were installed in 1989. Other receptors in the area include residential properties and surface water bodies. Next slide, please. And on March 31st, 2018, the owner returned from a month-long vacation and found out inventory reconciliation was not being done in her absence. The owner conducted inventory reconciliation and indicated that a release may have occurred. A site check was conducted and gasoline was found in the fill pump. Further investigation found a faulty valve. An estimate of 1,100 gallons of gasoline were released undetected over the course of 4 to 5 weeks. Next slide, please. On April 1st, 2018, the 2 gasoline USTs and associated piping were removed. A second source was discovered during this removal. A fitting on the gas supply line at the dispenser was found to be leaking. Next slide, please. Once the release was reported to the DEP, staff from the Emergency Response Unit and Site Assessment and Support Unit, which includes the LUS staff, responded to the site. The Storage Tank Enforcement Unit was called out to conduct an inspection, and an NLD was issued. The DEP and Remediation Division became involved due to the presence of a significant environmental hazard condition, groundwater contamination that threatened drinking water supply wells. Next slide, please. Remedial actions were expensive. A state road was closed to accommodate for the activities. Almost 5,000 tons of impacted soil were removed, and the excavation extended to bedrock. 36,000 gallons of impacted groundwater and product were pumped and treated. Following the excavation, recovery wells and monitoring wells were installed. Next slide, please. Here is an aerial view of the soil removal activities to show just how extensive the excavation work was. Next slide, please. The USTs were removed on April 1st. The final soil samples were collected from the excavation on April 26th. After the initial excavation stage, only 3 soil samples out of 38 had ETPH or benzene above the respective pollution mobility criteria. Of the soil samples collected from the final extensive excavation, only 7 soil samples had detected constituents of concern, and all of those were below the respective regulatory criteria. Next slide, please. Following the soil excavations, 2 recovery wells, 3 overburden monitoring wells, and 7 shallow bedrock monitoring wells were installed. After the initial sampling, only the recovery wells had detected constituents of concern. Benzene was detected above the groundwater protection criteria of 1 microgram per liter, and total xylenes were above the surface protection criteria of 270 micrograms per liter just during the first sampling, after which only benzene was detected above criteria in the 2 recovery wells through 2019. So far for 2020, only one sampling event was conducted on February 20th, and all COCs were below both the method reporting limits as well as the regulatory criteria. Surface water bodies were sampled in 2018, and all constituents of concern were below regulatory criteria. New USTs were installed at the site in August 2018. Next slide, please. All properties around the site are serviced by private water wells. The private water wells were sampled in April, May, and June 2018. No constituents of concern were detected in any of the drinking water samples. And that's the map that shows the location of the other properties that had a private wells. Next slide, please. What still needs to be done? There has only been 1/4 of groundwater monitoring data below the method reporting limits and regulatory criteria. For Connecticut, 3 more quarters are needed to achieve this regulatory 4 quarters below criteria. Regulations allow for the 4 quarters to be achieved over 2 years. So if the spring 2020 sampling cannot be conducted due to the COVID-19, they are allowed to do a sampling in 2021 for the spring, assuming all of the quarters remain below criteria. The NOB remains open as it requires full compliance with the RSR to close. So groundwater samples must meet the regulatory criteria before it can be closed for 4 quarters. Next slide, please. So why do we consider this a success even though it hasn't been closed yet? All of the gasoline impacted soils were removed, including the impacts that were under a state road. Sensitive receptors, the private wells, the surface water bodies, residential properties were all protected. There were no impacts to any of them. Within 2 years, the groundwater at the site has dropped below state criteria. And while state involvement occurred during the initial emergency stage of the project, the owner's insurance covered all costs, including those spent by the state. Next slide, please. Oh, you missed one. Can you go back one? Here we go. Lessons learned. The most important lesson learned, follow the UST regulations. This release would have been detected a lot earlier, reducing the loss of product and the area of impact if inventory reconciliation was conducted properly and regularly as required by regulations. Also, make sure your station personnel is properly trained, because if they were doing the inventory, it would have been detected. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the station has been operating with new USTs since September 2018, and no new releases or issues have been reported for this site. Any questions?